Hello, folks, and welcome once again to another episode of Policy Square. Policy Square, an initiative along with Business World, wherein we go behind the headlines. This week, we are talking to Mr. Atanu Chakraborty, who was Secretary DEA, Government of India, and currently the chairman for HDFC Bank, India's largest private sector bank, and really talk about the budget, not just what he expects out of the budget, but what goes behind framing of the budget document. With that, let me welcome Mr. Atanu Chakraborty to Policy Square. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us. I know you're in the US and late in the evening for you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's really a pleasure to have you, and an opportune time because I think India and whole of corporate India in particular, and housewives and every Indian actually looks forward to the budget in early February. And we thought we don't have anybody better than you to talk about the budgeting process and your expectations, sir. But before we really get into the expectations, one thing that I personally always wanted to ask, and really the Indian audience imagination has always been captured by this annual event wherein the minister walks into the parliament with the budget in her hand, bundled in red clothes, an image of how the budget has been presented. If you could really reflect on a bit on the history part of that, sir, because I'm sure I am not fully aware of it, and nor are our audience.
Good morning, Nilay, to you and your colleagues. It's a pleasure, and you have been very kind with the introduction. You mentioned something very interesting, the bundle wrapped in red. The symbolisms of the budget have changed over a period of time. And essentially, it's a budget speech which gets carried by the finance minister to the parliament. Budget documents reach separately and are distributed to the parliamentarians. Finance minister reads out the budget speech. Earlier, it used to be a briefcase. If you recollect and see the old photograph, you will see the finance minister with a black or a red, depending upon where it is, a particular or a maroon briefcase. The present finance minister has added a new, I would say, a new dimension to it by having it wrapped in a beautiful red. We were all very surprised ourselves when we saw it for the first time, but it looked very nice, very Indian, and I guess has become a new symbol for the budget.
Absolutely, sir. In fact, I remember the photographs and the customary photograph, and you being next to the FM when she presented it a couple of years back, and that really is my next question. While many of us see the budget being announced in early February, I'm assuming it's a very long process. Really wanted to get a sense of how do you go about putting a budget together, especially as Secretary DA. That's something that you were entrusted with within the Ministry of Finance. Really wanted to understand just the process part of how do we get to the budget, sir.
Nilay, I would share the part of the process which is public, to be fair, to ensure that rest of it, I don't end up saying something which need not be said. So, in a sense, budget making is a very public exercise. As much as it sounds to be very shrouded in secrecy. These are two dimensions of the budget. That's how they appear in public, but it's a very, very public exercise. Meetings with the stakeholders are something which start almost a month and a half before the budget making actually starts. Even before that, in October, the revised estimate for the budgets are made. That, in a sense, is the kicking off for the budget, because the revised estimate on the expenditure, what sort of puts the ceilings on the current year's spending and gives a basis for what needs to be provided for the next year. The revenue estimates come much later, and then subsequently, of course, the the debt, which is driven by the FRB, and the fiscal deficit number, which is always talked about. And along with that, a host of people, apart from the regular meetings which finance minister takes over almost a fortnight, there are inputs which come from academicians, from business groups, from host of other stakeholders, which keep feeding into the budget making exercise. Whether in terms of a policy statement, whether in terms of an additional provisions, whether in terms of certain tax-related issues which come in. And to top it all, of course, there are departments who also receive their own representations, departments and ministries, and in turn funnel into the ministry in terms of their paragraphs which get into the budget. So in a sense, this is a huge flow which keeps coming into, I almost always liken it to the river Ganga, which has a very large number of tributaries. They keep flowing till you reach Rishikesh and you get one river Ganga. So it's a very interesting exercise, and how it sort of melds into a one single document at the end of it. And of course, it has 15 different documents, and now perhaps even more than that, which makes for the entire budget. It's a very, very fascinating exercise in itself.
Absolutely, sir. So just one other quick question. You talked about a fascinating journey, sir, the budget preparation. Any anecdotes of that you can share around this process? Something that really people would not know, but you can share.
Perhaps people know about it, but I liked certainly the most interesting part. I have a sweet tooth, and I always have looked forward to the budget halwa when the actual budget making exercise, the press is started, where the actual thing really comes out. And it's a halwa. It's a ceremony which is very sacrosanct. Finance minister himself or herself uh, sort of gives that prasad to everybody. It's a very solemn, at the same time, a very interesting exercise, which I have found to be one feature which people when they say that halwa means the budget has started.
Really, sir. Sir, if I could just move on to, how does the government, because as you mentioned, while the revenue numbers and expenditure numbers today tend to be rather well known over a period of time, given that these informations are available, but it's also a policy tool, the budget exercise and the announcement. How does the budget decide its priority in some senses? And also, sir, your thoughts around the upcoming budget. What would perhaps be two or three areas for priority for the government for this year's budget?
Well, there are two questions in one, so let me answer them in that sequence, Nilay. First, it's a policy statement, perhaps the most important one, because this is one policy statement which has numbers attached to it. It has numbers related to the revenue side, what taxes would come in, how the new tax proposals are going to impact. It has on the other side the expenditure numbers, which gives the direction of the government of India's policies as to what they want to do. Each year, for example, when the housing was taken up, so there was allocation for housing. Initially, each of these schemes, when they declared, may not have a very large allocation, but the directions are very clear. Similarly, for drinking water and so on and so forth. It also tells us to which direction the government is going to take. So, and it is just not a statement of saying that, okay, we are going to do this. Then numbers, hard numbers attached to those. Then there are numbers related to debt, which make full impact on the interest rate, inflation, and so on and so forth. So in a sense, if you see, this is one policy event which has a whole load of impact on the entire economy, whether in the capital market side, whether it's a common man or any other stakeholder, you name it. And that's why perhaps the interest around it. Many people have mentioned that budget is an exercise which we can ignore and all. I found it very difficult for this to be digested because it does make an impact. And since it makes an impact, people are not going to, otherwise we wouldn't be talking about it today. And so it's a policy tool because there are numbers, there's a direction in numbers, and those numbers then throughout the year would get discussed, which would also form the basis of lots of proposals. And the finance minister's speech itself then contains policy directions in the number of paras that come in. And each para is a very potent policy statement. Never during the year you would see in one speech so many policy statements being given. Coming to this budget, economist has in this issue has talked about one very interesting phrase they have used of predictable unpredictability. I guess that is going to be the cornerstone for whatever economic event that happens. The other thing which I see globally is that the governments are taking action on inflation, especially the advanced economies are taking action on inflation, which is going to have an impact. The global interest rates would sooner than later rise, which would also have an impact on sort of our things. Normally, I would see a midstream budget. In a sense, it's midway between new government coming in 2019 and 2024 election. I would not expect many new policy initiatives. I would rather see more of those initiatives being further panned out, explained, allocations provided if need be, or new initiatives for those existing initiatives being further explained or declared. However, considering unpredictability, there would be something or the other which needs to be done with the government of the day feels, and I guess that should happen. But as I mentioned, the global parameters for our budget is essentially the Delta/Omicron and global inflation issues which are seen. And in the light of this, the global supply chain getting continuously disrupted or coming up again. And that does impact the manner in which we are going to do our work. It's a strange, at the same time, a brave new world one is entering. And perhaps 2 years down the line, things have changed a lot, perhaps. 10 years or 15 years later, when we sit back and realize how we worked in 2019 and how we worked in 2022 was a whole lot different. And that's going to make an impact. And a budget will nilly take that into account. The demand patterns would change. The consumption patterns are likely to change. They have changed already. Your platforms, large number of platforms have coming in. And there's a number of things which you would know already have. So I guess the budget would be, of course, growth is an issue which always remains a cornerstone for any budget. And how to keep the growth impulse on. This year we have seen reasonably satisfactory numbers in Q1 and Q2. So we do hope that that impulse will continue.
Absolutely, sir. I think the way you describe predictable unpredictability is a good one, and you're right about inflation. Obviously, many central banks around the world have indicated their or are starting out on moving away from an accommodative stance to a little more wherein they're worried about inflation. Uh, so before you were Secretary DA, you were Secretary Disinvestment as well. That's continues to be, and I do remember one of the largest disinvestment, 80,000 plus crores, is something that you oversaw when PFC and REC happened, and subsequently, what you had initiated in Deepam at that point of time for Air India, the changes, we've seen that success happening in this financial year. I assume, sir, disinvestment will be an important element, will continue to be an important element from a revenue perspective for the government. But really, what do you see around disinvestment and really government's thinking in the next financial year?
Well, it's if you see revenue numbers from disinvestment, perhaps the numbers will really tell us because they will tend to come in Q4, some more numbers on how much resources have been raised through disinvestment. I'm sure they would be healthy, though today they are not as good as the government would like it to be. However, already the pipeline is full, and that is something which is very healthy. If you see, Air India has given a excellent tailwind to the disinvestment process itself. Now there are BPCL, there is among good companies, there's a container corporation and a couple of other strong companies which can possibly bring in a lot of revenue and also change the narrative. You always have to also look at the narrative that, a big success tends to change the narrative also. Other than that, last year, a major, I would say, a watershed decision was privatization of banks. And hopefully, in the budget session, there would be necessary legislation that will come in to sort of take the process further, because those things are needed. One didn't expect this to happen overnight. And yes, already Niti Aayog has done some of its work, as one learns from the press. But as soon as the legislative work on this gets over, maybe Department of Disinvestment would be ready, along with Department of Financial Services, to take forward the bank privatization forward. I guess that is one area where not only will fresh capital come in, because through banks, their equity share, a large amount of capital can flow in. That will also really give the reform process another wind, if I may use that phrase. That's how I see it. I do not see any new policy directions that are needed to be done. More or less, if we add a couple of more companies, because the bank part is already done, LIC possibly should happen whether in Q4 or Q1 of next financial year. Is just a matter of when the things happen. But important thing would be as to how we see the process going forward. Necessary legislations, the groundwork, the bidding process. A bit of a boring stuff, but that's how things need to happen, and that's how I see the trajectory. It's, frankly, I do not expect any earth-shaking announcements on disinvestment. I would rather look at the fine print on things going forward.
So just one question on a personal note, sir. Having been in the public sector with government for more than almost close to 4 decades, sir, how does it feel to be chairman of India's largest private sector bank? How has life changed for you?
Well, Nilay, it's been a the bank accounts for HDFC Bank accounts for more than 10% of the banking business of the country. In a sense, it becomes and its spread is across all sectors of the economy. So it's a microcosm of the economy itself. So in a sense, it gives me a feel of continuity.
Absolutely, sir. For somebody like me who's had the privilege of working with you for many years, it's amazing to see you, and you know, and the ease with which you've transitioned into your new role. I mean, just it's pleasure to just watch it. But just before we close it, I have to ask this question. I know civil servants don't necessarily go back and give advice, once they've left a position. But I have to ask this question. If you had one advice for the finance minister's team for this budget, what would that be, sir?
I would say very tasty halwa, Nilay.
Yeah, I guess some things I can't change.
No, I guess they are really into, they have faced 2 years of an onslaught of unpredictability, which nobody would envy their position because daily the things have changed. Uh, they have kept their cool, they have continued in the same, they have sort of kept chugging on. One can only, I'm sure they are in full command of what they know, what needs to be done. But ask that what one has mentioned, that in the position that one is today for the country, that demand compression is not going to go away very quickly with inflation on the other side. It is an infrastructure investment being made possible through a host of things, both physical as well as on the financial side, like corporate bond market. Such things are the key to future prosperity. That's how I see, and that's how countries have come out of a major shock to the economies in the past, whether it was the Second World War or these kind of an event or a pandemic of this proportion. And that's an event. When we live through it, we don't understand. Later on, the history will talk about how severe this event had.
Thank you so much, sir, for being with us on Policy Square, and really look forward to seeing the budget. I am sure many of your thoughts will get reflected because you have been an insider to that particular process. And look forward to seeing you back in India soon, sir. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Nilay, for calling me to Policy Square, and Godspeed to this new platform of yours. I'm sure it will go great places. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir.
Folks, thank you so much for watching another episode of Policy Square, and we look forward to seeing you in the next edition. Bye bye.